Hi, my name is Chana, and this is Relationship Physics. So, what is relationship physics? Most of the time, when we talk about relationships, we're used to hearing chemistry. A lot about the chemistry of people, whether or not they're compatible, is there a spark? We hear a lot about the chemistry of relationships, or specifically the chemistry between people. Likewise, I think most of us have an idea of how biology plays a role in relationships, particularly as it relates to, pheromones, and I guess that's chemistry too, though. Biology and chemistry. Anyway, so, pheromones and, how we reproduce, and we kind of get that there's biology involved as well. But not a lot of people are talking about the physics of relationships. So, a little bit about me. I am a therapist specializing in couples work and perinatal mood disorders and perinatal loss. A lot of times in my work with couples, I find that a lot of the theorems and laws of physics actually make a lot of sense. How do I know this? My bachelor's degree is in physics, and I used to work in that field. And I remember when I first started going back to school for counseling, I was like, oh my gosh, I picked a bachelor's degree that has nothing to do with what I now want to study. It's not going to be useful at all. And I didn't think it was going to be any good, any help to me when I was in grad school or once I became an actual therapist. However, what I learned is that a lot of what I learned in physics actually was really relevant, both practically from like the research side, and then also when I started working with clients, a lot of the laws of physics actually apply. And so that's what this series is going to be about. So each week, I'm going to highlight a different law of physics, a law, a theorem, an equation, whatever, explaining how it relates to and or manifests in relationships. I'm not going to go deep into the physics because I don't want it to be confusing for people who aren't science geeks. So as far as the physics goes, it's going to be really basic, but I am going to explain the concept and then explain how this shows up in relationships. So that's pretty much it, the physics of relationships. With that said, let's talk about Newton's first law of physics and how it applies to relationships. So, Newton's first law states that objects at rest tend to stay at rest, and objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. What this means in the natural world is that an object is going to keep doing whatever it's doing unless something attempts to stop it. So we see this most often, or an easy way to think of it is a ball that is rolling. We've all seen balls roll. The ball will keep rolling unless something stops it. Usually somebody goes and grabs it, or it bumps up against a curb, or eventually it starts to slow down because of the surface that it's rolling on. So something intervenes, and or the friction between the ball and the surface that it's rolling on eventually makes it stop. In most cases, it is the force of friction which will stop a moving object from moving. It is also the same force of friction that you have to overcome in order to get an object that is at rest to start moving. So, to recap, objects tend to keep doing what they're doing unless something happens to either overcome the force of friction and get it moving, or the force of friction eventually slows it down, or something just intervenes to stop it, like in the case of the ball and hitting the curb. So, how does this show up in relationships? I'll give it to you straight. So, if that dude wasn't working when you met him and he wasn't working when you were dating, he's not going to suddenly start working because you move in together or because you get married. If she was a workaholic when you met her and was super ambitious and focused on her career and didn't have a lot of time for you when you were dating, she's not suddenly going to give that up just because you move in together or get married. And what happens in relationships is that people will be aware of what the person was like when they first got together, but then somehow when they get in a committed relationship or they move in together or they get married, they expect a change to just magically occur. That doesn't happen. And when the people involved get upset because it hasn't happened, they usually Going back to our definition of physics, try to do something to either stop the behavior that they don't like or give the lazy person a push so that they'll suddenly decide that they want to go to work every day. And this causes, you guessed it, friction. Friction has a few definitions. When it comes to physics, it's defined as the resistance that one surface or object experiences when moving relative to another. In relationships, it's defined as conflict or animosity caused by a clash of wills, temperaments, or opinions. Sort of like one person resisting the movement that another person wants them to make, either by stopping something they don't like or starting something they haven't been doing. We see this when one partner gets upset or starts to complain about an action that the other partner does or doesn't do, and it creates friction in the relationship. So, a lot of times people are surprised at the friction because what they're asking for is not unreasonable or excessive. Expecting your partner to contribute financially to a household that they live in is not unreasonable. Expecting your partner to put their clothes in the hamper instead of leaving them on the floor is not unreasonable. Expecting adults to clean up after themselves, again, is not unreasonable. But in relationships, a lot of times it's met with friction because the other person has not been doing this all along. That's not how they were accustomed to functioning. They were that stationary object or they were that moving object, and what you're asking them to do is contrary to what they've been doing all along, and they don't want to do it. Particularly if you entered the relationship fully aware that they weren't doing it when you started the relationship. Because a lot of times what I hear from partners is things like, well, she knew I didn't have a job when she met me. Good point. Yes, she did. And, talking to her, she's like, well, I just figured that when we got married, things would change. That is I don't even know what to say. That doesn't happen. That thinking is just bad, just bad thinking. Like, just seriously, just let it go. And I hear it so often, so many times people are like, well, I thought when we got married, things would change. Or I thought if we we moved in together, things would change. No, 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 no. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. And here's why. People get more comfortable over time, not less so. And it drives me crazy when I hear people say things like, if this person never changed from the way that they are, I would be okay with that, because that's unrealistic. People change, it's what they do. The reality is that people get more comfortable over time, not less so. And so all of those things that sort of drive you nuts, like a better question would be, if all of those things got 15% worse, could you live with that? Because that's what's likely to happen. People get more comfortable, they get more relaxed, they become more themselves. So if this person is already not meeting your expectations when you meet them or when you're dating them, it is not going to change because you get married. That's not going to happen. It's not going to change because you move in together, you're building a life together. That's not who they are. And quite frankly, it's not really fair to ask them to change if you accepted them without that when you first got together. So again, looking at Newton's law, objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest unless acted upon by an external force. What does this mean? This means that if they were lazy, they will continue to be lazy. And when you challenge that laziness by encouraging or nagging them to act differently, you will experience friction. It is the only way that a change is going to happen. And it doesn't mean that a change will happen, just that, it's not going to be a comfortable experience. But it makes sense that you would encounter friction because it's the only way to get something that's not moving to start moving. Likewise, if you have someone who is accustomed to kind of being out there and doing stuff, or maybe they're really ambitious and they work a lot, and you start pushing back about the amount of time that they spend on this thing that they've been doing all this time, including when you met me and when you were dating me, then of course there's going to be some pushback. You're going to get some friction because you're asking them to stop doing something. You're pushing back against trying to slow down the movement of something that was already moving in the first place. So that's Newton's first law. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. When it comes to relationships, that means that the person that you're with, the person that you meet, is going to keep being and or doing whatever it is that they normally do, and they're going to be who they are. And when and if you attempt to encourage them in another direction or nag them about their behavior, you will experience friction in trying to make that change occur. So that was how Newton's first law manifests in relationships. Next video, we'll be talking about Newton's second law, which, the equation for that, a lot of people are familiar with, force equals mass times acceleration. And we'll be talking about how that shows up in relationships too, because it does. If this makes sense to you, you want to hear more videos like this, or you're interested at all, please hit subscribe. I'll be doing one of these each week, talking about the physics of relationships. You can also hop over to my Instagram or my Facebook, where I do a thing called 60 Seconds of Sanity, where I just give you 60 seconds of wisdom about relationships, practical stuff that you can use immediately. So, thanks so much, and I'll see you next week. Bye.